Welcome to NED's China podcast hosted by T-Cosmos. They say data is the new oil or the new gold. Digital data are used by countries to gain global control. Representative Michael Waltz, who is Trump's pick as new national security advisor, stated on 2023 that
just the scale from which the Chinese Communist Party is gathering data is incredibly difficult to compete with.
The head of the FBI in 2023 said at CBS,
"The Chinese government sees cyber as the pathway to cheat and steal on a massive scale."
So, how important data collecting and trafficking is? Why China seems to be ahead? How data competition affects US-China relations? To discuss the above issues, we have invited Dr. Ann Kokas, expert on US-China media and technology relations. I'm your host, Mαριλίζα Αναστασοπούλου. Hello, today we have with us Dr. Ann Kokas, which is a great pleasure, by the way. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here in Athens.
Let me introduce you a bit, Dr. Kokas. She's the CKN professor at the Miller Center and the professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. And also, Dr. Kokas' research examines Sino-US media and technology relations. She has a lot of experience in all these issues and has worked with Congress, if I'm not mistaken. She has been in congressional hearings, and it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here at the NED's China program.
So we're going to try to have a brief discussion of about 20 minutes. We're going to be based on your recent book, which is very interesting. The title is Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. And based on your book and your research, we would like to see a bit the importance of data, why China has an advantage, a big advantage as far as I understand, when it comes to other countries, even to the US, or I would dare to say, particularly when it comes to the US because of the competition. And I would like us a bit to discuss how this affects Greece also, our little country here, but still it's our country. And our audience would like to know more about it.
So China is a really interesting case where while the US was the first mover in the development of data gathering tech platforms, and as Greece and other EU countries know, US tech platforms have not been necessarily good global citizens in terms of their data gathering practices and following global laws. But China builds on those practices that were established by the US to gather large amounts of user data. So Chinese firms, Chinese social media firms like TikTok, for example, gather user data like the US does. However, the key difference is Chinese laws, which can pressure Chinese firms to share user data with the Chinese government in a very systematic way. And this creates a really interesting dynamic where the Chinese government is able to access large amounts of user data and pressure Chinese firms quite systematically. Now, the thing that's also important to note here is that most foreign firms that gather large amounts of user data are not allowed to operate in China. So there's a huge competitive advantage as well, where local firms can use China's gigantic market to develop products that outcompete other firms elsewhere.
Okay, so let's start with a very simple analysis of what data is. So, I mean, it's obvious that China has the advantage from what you just mentioned. Why is data so important? Can we explain it a bit to our audience?
Yeah, so gathering data from corporations is important in a couple of levels. So first of all, there's the one that gives people the most immediate chills, which is the idea of being spied upon. Now, most people are actually not that interesting. So even though we all are wearing lots of devices and using a lot of devices that can gather information about us, it's actually not necessarily cost effective or interesting to spy on individual people. There are government officials, for example, where that would be an interesting target. Now, when thinking about the development of new products and services, this is where it becomes really interesting, because AI products and services rely heavily on the quality and scope of user data that a company is able to gather. And so the more data, the better the product, or the more data, the more efficient the product development can be. And so this is a really central feature of why it's important to be able to gather large amounts of user data. Now, a third point, which is one of the more chilling pieces of the book that I talk about, is gathering health data, which both has the benefit of being useful for the development of precision medicine, so medical interventions based on very specific data points like DNA or certain medical conditions, but also the development of bioweapons. So this is also a really important area to look at.
We have the impression that all they do is looking where we go, as if they care if we go here or there. I mean, the simple user. But we don't really understand the depth that you explained right now. So if I understand it correctly, it's a question that affects all aspects of not only our daily life, but manufacturing, military, healthcare, right? So the advantage that a country can get by having all this data and examining all this data is way beyond our understanding important. That's how I get it, right?
Well, and I think that it is within our understanding, and that's one of the reasons why I'm excited to be here to talk with you. I think it's just a slight shift in terms of how we think about user data. So when I'm talking with my students, most of them say, well, I don't really care if anything's gathered about me because I don't have anything to hide. And fair, probably they don't. But the key point here is that it's not about one person, it's not about an individual. It's about being able to model entire societies, to be able to target mis and disinformation, to be able to develop products that outcompete, to be able to develop strategic military applications. That's the really important part about large-scale data gathering.
So we have all this understanding of data gathering, and we have an understanding that China has an advantage. So my question is, why don't we do anything about it? I mean, we had this discussion, that's the easy example, in the US and in Europe, to ban, for example, TikTok. Let's not go there yet, but why there isn't enough regulation or even to ban things entirely if we believe that China is building this competitive advantage when it comes to the US, Europe, or other countries?
Well, one thing that I think is really important to note here, that we're in Greece and in the European Union, is that Europe has really been working to help stem a lot of data flow from the European Union through the EU Data Act and the AI Act. So I think that it would be unfair to say that, to characterize that European policymakers aren't doing anything. I think they're actually, we have the right to be forgotten here. As an American, I find European digital rights to be fascinating because I don't have them, and there's really a lot to be said for that. One of the big challenges, though, is that as new technologies evolve and as new forms of data gathering evolve, it's hard for regulations to stay abreast of those new types of data gathering. And I think about all the different times when you update an app or you buy a new connected device and you don't read the terms of service and it's not really clear how that app is or how that device is gathering data. That's where the real challenges are, that there's this kind of cat and mouse game between what companies are gathering and what regulations actually regulate.
Which it reminds me of a discussion we had, a lecture actually with someone from China that was doing very high AI, and that he was arguing that to have regulation, there's no point, because basically by the time the regulator understands what's going on and sets the regulation, the technology has evolved, fine. But then the EU is trying to do something. Is it working? Question number one. Secondly, if there's such an issue, how does China manage to both have the technology and regulate, and at the same time enjoy our unregulated technology? So that's a very smart thing to do. And thirdly, let's focus on the US. What the US should do when it comes to this data issue. When we had the discussion of banning TikTok or not banning TikTok, but is that the way to go about? I mean, these were three questions, so let's start with the first one.
Yeah, so I think that there is a persistent challenge with the question of how to regulate and what to regulate. And for example, one of the arguments that a lot of industry uses is, if you regulate us, then we won't be able to innovate, and we won't be able to innovate in ways that you would want us to innovate. And so there are a lot of reasons to push back against regulation. The point about, regulations not being able to keep up with development, also a really valid one. In a Chinese context, one thing that's quite interesting, and not necessarily something that I would urge Europe or the United States to emulate, but one thing that does allow them to stay abreast of a lot of the regulations, to stay abreast of a lot of the developments, is the very close relationship between Chinese private sector firms and the Chinese government, and the amount of power that the government has over the private sector. So because of that greater connection, there's less daylight between the regulations and the firms. Now, one area that China has developed and worked on that I think actually the EU and the US could learn from, or is something that's worth noting, is the high level of technical expertise in the Chinese government when making regulations. And I think the EU does a really good job of this. I think in the US there's somewhat less of that because frankly most people in the tech sector prefer to stay in the private sector for most of their careers because of the huge difference in salaries. And even in the context of the new Department of Government Efficiency that is going to be run by Elon Musk in the United States, that's a really interesting case because my understanding is in order to not go through the security clearance process, they are not getting paid.
Yeah, that's my understanding too, but maybe it's a bit too early. I wanted to have a comment on that. How, so maybe that's the time to ask that. How the new government that is going to be in place in January the 20th, how the views you think will affect the technology sector? And what troubles me is, on the one hand, we have Trump being very strict when it comes to China and the tariffs and so on and so forth. And at the same time, if I understand it correctly, the tech people saying we want unregulated so we can be more efficient. But the one is very contradictory to the other. That's a very general impression I have.
So I think it's a great question, and I think time will really tell in January, once the new government takes over, how things actually play out. One thing that we have seen already is a kind of unprecedented level of closeness between between President-elect Trump and several key tech leaders in the United States. Elon Musk spending huge sums of money to help support his campaign, taking a very prominent role in early discussions with appointees and with foreign leaders, as well as Jeff Bezos, who has a huge stake in the federal government with large data centers in Northern Virginia, choosing to, in conjunction with the New York Times editorial board, kill the presidential the recommendation to nominate Kamala Harris. So basically the Washington Post had previously supported one candidate over another, and they declined to do that this year. And the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. So there's a different level of political engagement than we have seen and a different level of closeness than I think we've seen in previous elections, which reflects the very high stakes of government intervention.
But then, and now that's a question that goes to policy, but also to the political, but also when it comes to the entrepreneurial side, part of it. For example, Tesla, Elon Musk and Tesla has very high involvement in China. Apple has, I don't know, I think even the iClouds, I don't know if it's the Chinese iCloud, the Asian iClouds in China. So there is an interconnection much deeper than the general discussion, oh, what can we do with TikTok? I mean, could you elaborate a bit on that, on how data and companies are kind of interconnected when it comes to China to get an understanding, a more practical understanding?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really important to note here is that when people talk about the US and China being functionally equivalent, where the Chinese government is able to regulate Chinese tech firms and the US government regulates US tech firms, I think the question that you asked really gets to the core of why they're very, very different situations. Because no Chinese firm could be as dependent on the US market and US government relations as a firm like Apple or Tesla would be in China. That would lead to a significant political crackdown. I mean, even we saw Jack Ma was pushing back against Chinese government fintech regulations, and when he did so publicly, disappeared for 3 months after.
That's the Alibaba.
Yeah. So Jack Ma was the founder, founder of Alibaba, who's now stepped down. And so this is a categorical difference between the relationship of the US tech sector and the Chinese tech sector. And as we can see, with the ability to kind of underwrite presidential campaigns, the power balance is actually shifted in arguably a different direction, where there's a huge amount of influence, political influence, held by the tech sector on the US government at this point. We'll see how that all plays out. And one thing that I've learned from years looking at these issues is it's always dangerous to make any kind of predictions. So I don't know what's going to happen, but it's interesting.
Of course, we do not just, we're trying to understand, to get an assessment of let's put it like that, of the situation. So we have all this data collection from data brokering or data trafficking, and there I would like you to make a brief explanation of the difference and the importance of them. We have data trafficking and data brokering. Could you explain to the audience what's the difference?
Yeah, so data trafficking is the gathering of user data without user consent or with limited user consent. So when people don't actually know that data is being gathered about them. And when that data is shared across borders or shared with other governments without their consent. And so that's what happens in a US context, especially when data is gathered by firms that have close ties to China, and the Chinese government can pressure those firms for access to that data. As I noted, the EU has more regulations in support of preventing cross-border data transfer. That doesn't mean it doesn't ever happen, but it means that there are more guardrails in place. Now, the key difference between data trafficking and data brokering is when a company gathers user data, and then users agree that that data can be shared with a third party. And this whole sharing with a third party covers a lot of sins. It includes a lot of different possibilities. And then that firm can sell user data to other countries. So it's a little bit more of a transparent process. And in the US, it's legal.
So I would advise our audience, next time they click accept to an application, just to go over what they accept to. It would be interesting, I think, to realize how our little data gets collected and given to other parties. And how would, for example, China, and I'm saying China particularly because we mentioned that China is the one that has the advantage, could use all this data gathering and all this influence that it has to its companies to actually advance its own financial interests in other countries. So there's also this aspect that let's have a brief comment on that.
Yeah, so one thing that's notable about the Chinese market is that it's large and self-sustaining in a lot of different contexts. So when the Chinese government forbids other data gathering or digital apps from operating within the Chinese market, or in the case of a firm like Apple, allows them to operate, but then allows that operation only to occur when sharing key intellectual property, and then essentially shuts that company out of the market for that technology once they develop it themselves. It creates a dynamic where the Chinese firms are able to survive and grow without the support of foreign markets, or they can outcompete other companies in foreign markets because they have this robust domestic market that they can fall back on. And so this creates a real competitive disadvantage for other countries that can't operate in China and other firms that can't operate in China.
And how all this connects to AI, which is a la mode, the a la mode thing, artificial intelligence, how all this data is connected to artificial intelligence that China seems to be quite advanced there too.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example that I think was very evocative for me. And one of the things I talk about in the book is health data. So China has the National Genomic Database where firms that gather any kind of genome data need to share that data with the National Genomic Database. And this National Genomic Database then integrates a wide range of data from around the world, and it's able to help guide the development of new health technologies. So things called precision medicine, which is this idea of being able to develop DNA or disease-specific solutions to health problems, which is a really important health intervention. It also has the capacity to develop bioweapons, specific targeted bioweapons. So the bigger the data set, the more empowered AI tools can be to develop new important technologies that are based on that data.
So it gets kind of scary when we realize where this can lead. Now we're in Greece. Could you give us some examples how we are affected, what we could do?
Yeah, so first of all, I think really working with allies and partners around the world and working with the European Union to be able to execute these laws as clearly and transparently as possible, I think is first very important. Greece is fortunate in the sense that there are legal protections for individual users through the AI Act and through the Data Act that I don't enjoy necessarily as an American citizen. So I would say making sure that those are as robust as possible is a very important first step. One of the unique vulnerabilities that Greece faces is, Ilya Rubanis at IDIS, I think, does really interesting work on this that looks at logistics data, specifically port logistics data and transit logistics data. And Lodging, which is a Chinese firm, is heavily invested in the port of Piraeus. And
Costco.
And Costco, the Chinese shipping firm. So I think looking at all the data and sensing and logistics that are around the port of Piraeus is also very important for Greece in particular when looking at a lot of these issues. And so those would be the first few. The other couple of funny examples that I noted were there are some Chinese firms that operate in, for example, the home security area. So there's a firm called Eufy. There's another firm called General Electric, which was a US brand that was purchased by a Chinese brand. And they both operate here in Greece and have app-enabled home devices. So anytime one downloads an app onto one's phone, that creates a vulnerability, data vulnerability. So I would say just understanding the provenance of one's home devices is also something that tends to be interesting to look at for individual protection.
So to wrap it up, after all this research you have done, what would you advise our audience to be careful to look at? I mean, what would be a nice idea, a good idea?
So I get this question a lot, and one of the big challenges with it is that unfortunately I don't think this is a problem that can be resolved just by individual action. Because data gathering at its most powerful is a collective activity. So the most important thing, I think, is to work with government officials in Greece and in the EU to continue, to the degree possible, developing robust regulations and trying to make sure that those are implemented as effectively as possible. I realize that's a lot less satisfying than saying, don't download these 3 apps or use these child controls, but fundamentally, I think we need to start shifting our thinking about how to address these issues.
I was hoping for a more practical advice, but I get it.
I know. I mean,
so many
and I could tell you, I mean, don't let your kids use social media that has a lot of facial recognition on it. That's probably also something that's worth doing as well.
It has been fascinating. I hope I will have the pleasure to talk to you in the future. Dr. Kogas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.